takes place electronically. So, you know, those might be some troubleshooting tips that you include on there, just some helpful reminders on how to log on to the system and what to do in case you run into any issues. And then a few little best practices for during the meeting is to be respectful, speak slowly and clearly, and always introduce yourself. And that's especially important on a teleconference if that's the mode that you choose to do your electronic meetings, because there could be a lot of people on the teleconference call, and it's important to know who's on and who's speaking. And then just a little helpful reminder for after electronic meetings, post the meeting online as soon as possible. So, you know, those in the public that were unable to attend the live stream have the opportunity to review after. And it's always important to debrief after as well, you know, if something didn't go right with the technology, or if there were some issues throughout the meeting that, you know, because the electronic meetings probably are relatively new, so you want to work through some of those glitches. So I'll circle back to some of the questions that we didn't get to last week. And one of them was, with respect to the special meeting to amend the procedure bylaw, is it permitted to have other items on the agenda? So the Municipal Emergency Act allows for a special meeting to take place to adopt the amendment to the procedure bylaw to allow for the electronic meetings during emergencies. So this, we're suggesting, should be the only item on that agenda for that special meeting. And then, you know, if there's other items to be discussed, then council can close that special meeting and then open another meeting and handle any other business that they may have. Another question was, if there are multiple meetings in one night, can they all be recorded together? So for example, can you set the Zoom meeting once and then run multiple meetings throughout? So you can have one single meeting and open and close each meeting as appropriate. For example, if you have a special meeting and then a regular meeting, you can have one recording, but your minutes would reflect multiple meetings took place. So there's no requirement to stop and start the meeting. However, we have to keep closed meetings in mind. So it would depend on your procedure bylaw if there's a requirement in there to record your closed meeting. So either way, the closed meeting should be kept completely separate from the recording that includes your special or open meeting. Another question was, how do you have a closed meeting using a teleconference? So if you're having a closed meeting using teleconference, here I would suggest that you provide the teleconference call-in information only to those who are to be involved in the closed meeting. So if you have an open meeting and then a closed meeting, the call-in information for both those meetings should be separate and should be different. They should not be the same call-in information, because if it is, then you risk people who are to attend the open meeting accidentally call into the closed meeting early or late and end up being a part of it when they should not be. So I would be very mindful of that and make sure that the call-in information is different. Another question, if council wishes to continue meeting in person while practicing social distancing and honoring the maximum 5-person gathering rule, is this permitted? Technically, yes. This can occur. So if council wishes to continue to have council meetings in person, they can, but they have to make sure that the order prohibiting public gatherings of more than 5 people is followed. However, we are suggesting to avoid this. We have to take this pandemic seriously. And, you know, just for example, if a municipality does continue to have their council meetings in person, I mean, if we're taking into account the mayor attending, the CAO, clerk, perhaps somebody from IT, that doesn't leave much room for any councillors to attend. So we're really, you know, trying to suggest that council does not do that. You don't want to promote leaving people, having people leave their homes and risk the potential that quite a few people do end up showing up to the council meeting in person, and then you know, you're going to have to turn people away, and it could become an issue. So we're recommending that perhaps that doesn't happen. The next question is, can a zoning bylaw be passed in a meeting that is held electronically? So council can deal with matters that would normally be dealt with at council meetings, even if it's held electronically. However, we are suggesting that any matters that don't need to be dealt with right away be deferred to a later time. So if there's a bylaw that could maybe be passed at a later time, then we suggest that it be deferred to that time. But if it's something that has to be dealt with right away, then it can be dealt with. Another question, is it accessible to send closed meeting packages by email to municipal email addresses of councillors if council has ordered that to be done? And the worry here is about confidentiality. So I would consult your procedure bylaw to determine what it says about, you know, closed meeting packages and how they're distributed. But under the current circumstances, sending by email may be the most viable option at this point. And instead of having councillors attend the municipal office to pick up the packages, again, we want to try and keep people at home as much as possible. So to deal with the issue of confidentiality and security, we would suggest that if closed meeting packages are sent to councillors by email, that they be password protected. You know, because you want to be very careful about this. So having a password required in order to open the document, whether it be PDF or another document, we're suggesting that that be the case. So I believe those were all the questions from last week that unfortunately we didn't get to answering. So I will pass it on to Nuala and Paul.
Thanks, Mia. There's a couple of things that I did not do at the beginning because of the bit of a rocky start. First of all, I didn't introduce Brittany Hodgkinson, and I apologize to Brittany and all of you for that. Brittany is a new addition to the team, and she's kind of the municipal point person that we have. And so you will probably deal with her on a fairly regular basis. And if you ever have any questions or need some help, feel free to reach out to Brittany and she will grab one of the team to ensure that you get help right away. She's very, very valuable to all of us, and I just really thank her for her assistance. The other thing that I think is important to emphasize, it was on the invitation, but the seminars that we're doing, we've got an agreement with AMCTO that they will count for your AMP and CMO accreditation. So if you need help with that, please reach out to Brittany and she can help you document that for your continuing legal education. I do have a question that I would like to answer now, and that is, will a recording of this webinar be available? And yes, we are recording it. And just like the last week, we will send out an email with the YouTube link so that you can see the webinar in the future if you want it. And we also have the recording from last week's webinar, which started much more smoothly. And so now I'm going to pass the matter over to Nuala, and Nuala and I are going to have a bit of a discussion with you about the current issues of declaring emergencies, municipal emergencies specifically, to be clear, and the idea of restricting our borders and the issues with respect to that. So I'll hand this over to Nuala now.
Good morning, everybody. I want to say at the outset, I'm delighted that so many of you were able to join us. That's one of the indicators that we have that you're doing okay and that you're managing during this really unprecedented time of crisis. It really means a great deal to us professionally and personally that you are okay and that you're able to join us on something like this. Tim and I are together, but that is a last effort because our technology wasn't working from the office. We would not be sitting close like this. We are taking the warnings of the Premier very, very seriously. It's reiterated to us again and again through the partners and through Paul not to be at work, to really limit that. And we do take it seriously. I don't want to begin a seminar about how we can work remotely and be safe, and then we're doing the opposite of it. It does mark an anomaly for us. So just on the emergency piece, because this is really unprecedented times for all of us, we're trying to grab the tools that we are familiar with to try and address the issue. Now, March 17th, the Premier of Ontario, as you know, declared a state of emergency in the province. And since that time, we're seeing a rash of municipalities also declaring states of emergency in their municipalities. Not a wrong thing to do, just a couple of cautions that we've come across as we were looking at this question. When we started to see this trend, WMG team started to say, what's going on? Why are municipalities doing this? We've got various answers, but we do have a set of best practices for you if you're thinking about declaring a state of emergency. So the ability for a municipality to declare a state of emergency comes from the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. And it allows only the head of council, the lieutenant governor, or the premier to declare a state of emergency. So insofar as Premier Ford has seen fit to declare a state of emergency in Ontario, it's not necessary to get you into certain legislative privileges that you might not normally have. So for example, the amendments to the Municipal Act are as a result of the declaration of an emergency, a provincial declaration of an emergency. So you didn't need to also declare an emergency in your municipality just to enjoy the right to, say, meet electronically. Previously, and Paul and I were saying this all along, how we had practiced and been taught, good idea for a municipality to declare a state of emergency because it opens the door to some funding envelopes that wouldn't be open normally. That is not the case with the current legislation, one. And two, we've had pretty extensive conversations. We speak pretty regularly with MMAH to try and make sure that we're all singing the same song. There's supposed to be sort of a backstop for municipalities, and we don't want people that are providing municipal legal advice like the WMG team to be running afoul of anything they would say. So the MMAH has been pretty clear that there is no funding envelope for COVID-19. There is no pot of money that you can dip into if only you would declare a state of emergency. Despite that, we have had a number of municipalities, and we've spoken to some of them to say, why did you choose to do that? Why did it go in that direction? We've got various answers. Some people have said administration didn't want to do it, but the politicians wanted to do it. It was sort of in answer to a cry from the community. And so I can understand the rationale for doing it, but I guess I'd like to offer a couple of cautions before you do it. And it may well be taken from administration's hands and put into the hands of the mayor, who might just declare a state of emergency, which can be done. The first thing I want to stress, it's not just with states of emergency, but with this whole crisis that we're dealing with. There is something about as lethal as the coronavirus, and that is panic of the coronavirus. And part of your jobs as municipal leaders, as the support for your municipally elected officials, part of your job is to quell the panic. You want people to be safe, and it's impossible to be safe if you're panicking. So consider the impact of the declaration of an emergency. Is it going to create a bushfire in your community? Is it going to create more panic than it's worth? Excuse me. And also the redundancy that it's already been declared for by the province. So what do you benefit from doing that? Now, it may be that you do benefit something. Your emergency bylaw might say, we've tucked away money that can only be retrieved if the mayor declares a state of an emergency. Okay, well, that would make things different. Your bylaw might allow the mayor to do certain things that he couldn't do normally just under the Municipal Act, but he can only if a declaration of emergency has been declared. So consider the reasons why you are declaring the state of emergency. If you do declare a state of emergency, very strong recommendation that you keep your communication with council, with staff, and with your community very high. So that might mean regular press releases. It might mean more regular updates to your website, all in an interest of keeping the community informed, while quelling the panic. Sometimes we have heard from communities saying, our community is not taking it seriously. Our community is not taking the emergency measures seriously and the social distancing. So we're thinking about declaring a state of emergency to bring the message home. I guess you need to sort of tailor it to your community. If you think that a local state of emergency declaration will be more effective than a provincial one, okay, it might be something that you'd like to consider. When you look at what constitutes an emergency under the Act, you know, this I don't think was really envisioned. Paul and I were speaking last week about a lot of times when you look at emergency, you're thinking about evacuation. Where are we going to get people? What hall are we going to have ready? What generators are we going to have ready? This is the opposite. This is how do you keep people inside? How do you limit traffic? How do you limit people from being too close to one another physically? So it is. I don't like to use the declaration of a state of emergency for any reason other than what's set out in the Act. So if it's to keep citizens in line, I don't know that that's a proper use of the Act, but it's not prohibited. So if you think that would be valuable in your community, then I think you could. Also in line with the communication piece, report back to council as soon as you can. Just like you hear us say with delegations of authority, if the mayor is doing something that you wouldn't expect a mayor to do, make sure she reports back to her council as soon as possible. If she's taken action, spent money, made some step, that should be reported back in an open council meeting. We don't shave off our obligation to be transparent and accountable just because we're in a state of emergency. And also consider when you're going to terminate that state of emergency. Is it going to be in line with what the province is doing? Is it going to have a set time and you'll go back and check it every 2 weeks or every 14 days or 10 days? What are you doing exactly? It shouldn't be ad infinitum. It shouldn't go on forever. And then the final piece, this isn't really, this is just a spidey sense, I guess I would say. We're concerned, WMG is concerned, if you declare a state of an emergency, at some point in the future, that might come back to bite you. Could be totally wrong. It's just speculative on our part, but we're concerned that when it comes time to pay the piper, and I think we are all starting to think about that because there's so many subsidy programs available and there's so many businesses, individuals, corporations really operating on a shoestring right now. When the day comes to pay for this crisis, it's possible that the province will say, well, the municipalities that declared a state of an emergency, they're the ones that are going to start ponying up some of the money. So it's just speculative. It's something to be cautious about, but really go through sort of a checklist in your own mind. Try and get your council to go through it. Is there benefit to us, not other communities, but to our community in declaring the state of emergency? So that's kind of a high-level overview of what I have to say on emergency declarations. And if you're thinking that this has gone on because we've got to such a late start, Paul, maybe we can save the limiting of municipal borders and swing back to it at the end. If so, I'm not taking up too much time.
Sure thing. There's a couple of things with respect to the emergency that that we had spoken about, Nuala, and we're going to have just a bit of a discussion. First and most important question in our mind when council and staff are talking about whether or not to declare an emergency is really just to ask why. What is the declaration of emergency going to get us that we don't already have? One of the answers that I've heard from some municipalities that have declared an emergency is the idea of enforcement. And with respect, the issue of enforcement has already been taken care of by the province. Now, this is something that council might want to consider. So the provincial orders with respect to social distancing, with respect to gatherings of more than 5 people, and with respect to essential services are all enforceable by the police, by public health officials, but also by any provincial offenses officer. And so what that means is that it is already now open to the municipality to instruct their bylaw enforcement officers to enforce the provincial orders with respect to social distancing and with respect to essential services. And I know that some municipalities have engaged that process on an active enforcement basis. What I mean by that is that it's not simply a complaints-based process, but actually they've tasked their bylaw enforcement officers with going around, particularly the commercial sector, making sure that the businesses that are open are properly essential services, making sure that the people attending those businesses are adhering to social distancing, and that sort of thing. So that already exists right now because of the provincial order. Now, it's not mandatory for municipalities to be out enforcing those orders. It is permissive. So council could decide, if you're having trouble in your municipality, and I know some of our clients are having trouble with various groups of people. And so your bylaw enforcement officer right now has the ability to go and enforce that if council makes that direction. So I just urge you to ask why you want to declare an emergency, be clear about what the reasons are, and then make an informed decision. I don't encourage municipalities to declare states of emergency just because all of their neighbors are doing it. Because we don't know at the end of the day what's going to happen with your emergency and how it's going to be looked at between the municipality and the province as to, okay, what portion of this was the provincial emergency and what portion of this was the municipal emergency. So those are my thoughts, and I don't know, Nuala, if you have any further thoughts on that after we've further discussed.
Thanks, Paul. I think that's really valuable and really in a nutshell what I was saying about declaring emergency. One caution I would say, if you are instructing your bylaw enforcement officers now to enforce the social distancing piece of it, I would urge you to give them a little tutorial that this is health related, so that you don't get people being, I know we had a couple of bylaw enforcement officers in the Sioux that were, well, you wouldn't have wanted to give these guys more power is the best way I would say it. You want to tell your bylaw enforcement officers, do this in a friendly way. It's about community health and safety rather than this being, sort of a zoning violation where they're being very, very aggressive. I think you want, and I think you're going to get more compliance like that. People, I was in the grocery store last weekend. I ran into a counselor that I used to work with. He's an older guy. He must have touched me on the back 6 times. He stood about 4 inches from my face. And, he's a friendly guy. He's an older guy. So people like that, that's how we're used to interacting with one another. You don't want now some bylaw enforcement officer coming up very harshly and saying, step, 2 meters apart. Just maybe remind them that it's done in the interest of everyone's health, and you'll get more compliance if you do it in a warm and friendly way. My suggestion.
I agree 100%. And Nuala, there's a question that's come up about who gives the direction to the bylaw enforcement officers to enforce. And that's a great question. And if we were to pretend that this was pre-March 10th of 2020, I think most of you would know that my answer would be that's operational, and that is something that council should properly stay out of, and that should be dealt with by the CAO. We're in different times now. And really, when you're looking at enforcement of the provincial order and public safety, public health and safety issues, I think that's properly a level of service decision that council should make. So while typically it may have been something that the CAO would used to do before COVID, I think when we're in this state of emergency, it's smart for staff to make these recommendations to council because they're pervasive. They're affecting the entirety of the municipal organization. And I think that's what moves it from really being an operational decision to being essentially a philosophical decision, a policy decision that council should be making on behalf of the community with respect to their 224 obligations to look out for the best interest of the municipality and make decisions with respect to levels of service. So I appreciate that question from Gabrielle. And I think that it's a lot more applicable, or it's applicable to a lot more issues than just the enforcement. So that's my thoughts on that. I don't know, Nuala, if you have any thoughts on that further.
I really agree with what you're saying. And if you never get too far away from the target, which is compliance, I think you're going to get more compliance if you do this in an open council meeting where you are saying, look, in the interest of the health of the community, we're now asking our bylaw enforcement officers not just to enforce zoning and building code and property standards, they're also going to be looking at this. Then the community hears about it, they're not going to be surprised, and you're going to get, I think, more compliance. Yeah.
Okay, so we'll move closing borders to near the end of the presentation. It's definitely one that we're going to do before we sign off because we've been hearing about it from more and more municipalities, and we think it's a very serious issue. But I'm going to hand the floor over to Tim right now, who's going to talk a little bit about Zoom and how to avoid the problems that we had this morning, as well as issues of security.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone again for joining and bearing with us while we experience some technical difficulties. One of the things it's unclear to me at this point whether that was an issue on Zoom's end or our end, and so what I'd like to do is follow up next week to address that issue. But I can say in the interim that Zoom, of course, most of us are probably familiar with. Zoom did experience some cybersecurity issues recently. Zoom put out an update, which you probably were either forced to or optionally given when you try to join today. The update essentially addresses some of those, and Zoom's also made available some of the features from its paid version to the free version, such as the password requirement, which we tried to use today. And also we tried to use the waiting room, and I believe Paul did use the waiting room this morning as well. And so one of the big reasons that you want to use passwords in waiting rooms is this whole concept of Zoom bombing, which is sort of the coined term now for uninvited guests trying to hijack your meetings essentially, or get access to your private meetings. And so passwords are obviously a great way to do that. One of the, in terms of concrete, what you can actually do in terms of using those passwords, again, the qualifier is we had some technical difficulties today, and I don't know if that's a learning curve on Zoom's part with how they're doing this, but the general guidance I can give in terms of specifically requiring passwords is there's an option to require a password when scheduling new meetings that you should enable, and require a password for instant meetings when you're hosting a Zoom meeting. You can also disable the option to embed the password for a meeting link for one-click join, and enable the required password for participants who join by phone. And that latter, depending on how you're using Zoom for your council meetings, I know Mia, I think, mentioned some ideas about those who were just joining by audio or not, or I should say otherwise not using the video. Make sure that they're able to use a password too. Again, the idea there is to protect the password. You can use a waiting room too, as Paul did this morning, basically to have it be that everybody comes into the meeting at the same time. That could be especially useful if you're doing some pre-meeting prep with anybody, let's say, and you don't want that you don't want people sort of joining up as you're doing that. You can also, of course.
I think that's useful to stop people from hearing me swearing, because the meeting doesn't start properly.
Exactly. You should have heard Paul. I'm just joking. But guys, one of the other things is you want to make sure you disable file transfer as well. Obviously, file transfer and possibly as well set the screen sharing to host only. File transfer, of course, file transfer is the main way that viruses can be transmitted, of course. And so you want to limit the ability of participants to do that. Right now, that's the best guidance that I have at the moment, understanding that we'll probably be circling back as we figure out what happened with our technical difficulties today at a future meeting. I don't know if we're going to be doing these every week, but we can certainly talk about that at the end if Paul would like to do that. Some of the general guidance, though, I know one of the other things that we've been hearing about from clients is our staff's working from home now. We have, whether we've got people in the office and a mix of remote workers, people are working from home. We don't necessarily have work devices for them to use, and so they're using their home laptop and their home network. And what are the issues there? And one of the big issues at the outset, I would say, is this underscores the importance of having acceptable use policies for if you are allowing the employee to have a work laptop, and even acceptable use with respect to files that are on the employee's home computer, if they're going to be allowed to do that. And I would say the importance there is to have two policies, or combine them. You'd have an acceptable use policy and a bring your own device policy. And so those I can provide some specific guidance to anybody who's interested in learning more about those. But some general tips and tricks for all of us, and to pass on to your employees. I won't take too much time, but I'll run through some ones that probably are basic to some people, maybe not to others, depending on your level of tech savvy. But the first one, of course, is for any computer, use a strong password. There are lists out there. I've looked at them myself. You can Google them. There's other lists that are available on the dark web of common passwords that people use. Some of those, of course, I hope nobody's using, but password, for example, is a very common password. Password 1 is another common one. A series of numbers like 11111, another common password. ABC 123, a sequence of numbers. Avoid those types of passwords. The best practice is try and use as many characters as you can, up to 10 if those are permitted. Include upper and lowercase characters. Include numbers and symbols as well. Try not to, and when I say that, I wouldn't, for example, think that using password with a capital W and the @ symbol for the A in password would qualify. Try and use random passwords as much as possible. And actually, if you go online and Google random password generator, you can find some sites that will randomly generate passwords. You can use, I've experimented with some of these as well, password managers. That can become a big thing if you do have increasingly complicated passwords, because they can become very hard to remember. So there's some good sense in using a password manager if you are going to take that step. And not all programs are going to allow you to do this, but using two-factor authentication is important. Especially, if I have somebody's password, for example, and I'm a hacker, and let's say if I have somebody's if I have somebody's email address, and or if I have access to their email password, and I want to reset a password for an app, let's say, or a program that they're using, so that I have access to that, usually I would just fill in the forgot password, put the email in, and if I have access to your email password, I could get in and change that password. So two-factor authentication means, you know, if you enable that, they would send you'd get a text message or a phone call or something like that as an additional measure, or perhaps you have to do a thumbprint if your device is capable of doing that, or facial scan. Another thing, especially this is really important for working from home, I use this myself, a virtual private network, or a VPN. Some of you, there's another benefit to this, which I didn't say in this webinar, but some of them, so we'll just pretend I didn't, but you can, some people may be familiar with using them to bypass geographic restrictions on content, because you can use these to essentially set your location. So some people I've heard have done that for different streaming services. But a more important thing for working from home is that the really important feature for a VPN is not only does it not show an attacker where you're located, but it also encrypts your internet traffic. And so it becomes unreadable to anybody who's trying to intercept it. That can include your ISP, for example, or hackers equally. VPNs can slow down internet speeds, so that's something to bear in mind. You can go online and find there's all sorts of VPNs. I'd recommend private internet access, which is what I'm familiar with, or NordVPN. Those are both good choices. There are a few others. Perimeter 81 is good for if you're trying to give a VPN to a group of employees. That's a good one to use as well. Setting up firewalls, of course, that's basically those act as a barrier between your device and the internet, essentially, by closing down ports. And what hackers will do is they'll use port sniffers to find out what ports are open on your devices. I won't get into the technical side of that, but needless to say, Windows has a firewall. You could just enable that. That'll give you and your staff some additional protection. Using an antivirus software, of course, Bitdefender is a great one. Malwarebytes is a free one that I use myself. So those are some good choices. Just make sure, you know, there's lots of other ones, Norton. So keep that up to date. Obviously, that's important. Keep all of the more apps you can keep on your computer up to date, the better. Always run the update. Hackers look at vulnerabilities, and so those are actively being patched as part of the updates that companies are pushing out. So make sure you install those regularly. Yeah, so I'm gonna wrap up there, guys. Just a few other quick things. You know, if you're working somewhere that somebody else can see what you're doing, make sure you lock your computer when you're away. Secure your wireless router. Change the password on it. Hackers can go in. There's lists of passwords specific to wireless networks. So if you have a wireless router that has a default password, you'll want to change that to make sure somebody driving by doesn't hijack your network. So those are some quick tips. Happy to discuss those policies with anybody or any of those security options in more detail. But other than that, I'll pass the floor back over to I believe it's to Paul and Anula.
Thanks, Tim. One of the things I didn't include in Tim's introduction is that he's got a master's in cybersecurity. And as you can see from the wall behind him, he's collecting degrees as a hobby. So if you're ever interested in talking about cybersecurity, Tim is very strong in that field. We did have a couple of questions that I think are important or comments even. One is that if you're using the Zoom platform, apparently if you have a password, and Tim, maybe you can speak to this as well, that uses alphanumeric or special characters, you cannot get into the Zoom meeting using a telephone. So that's something to think about. If you have counselors that don't have internet capability to join using a computer system and they're using a telephone, it may be important that you have a numeric password only for them. Tim, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, you know, that's something I'd like to think about some more. I mean, obviously you want to use strong passwords, but you also, you know, if your use of a strong password is going to prevent people from accessing the meeting, obviously that's going to be an issue and something you're going to have to think about. You know, my best advice there would be use as many different characters as you possibly can, and that is gonna change. For example, some programs aren't gonna allow you to use certain characters. Some aren't gonna allow you to make a longer password than others. Zoom, obviously, with telephone access, has some, you know, there's some restrictions around that, and so use as many as you can, but recognize that, you know, that's general guidance, and it has to be adapted to each situation, and depending on what's reasonable in the circumstances.
So Gail from Hornpain has a question about email packages, emailing closed session packages, and I think this is a good point, Gail. We typically don't like counselors to take the closed session package out of council chambers, and we often have systems set up where the way that they get to be aware of the closed session in advance of the council meeting is to come to chambers. We're having to adapt that because of the provincial rules and just the fact of trying to be safe with respect to health and safety. And we've commented on emailing, at the beginning, Mia commented on emailing the closed session package. Gail, I think it shouldn't be understood to say that we're recommending that you email the closed session package. And Hornpain, I understand, is using iCompass, and that has a process to have the closed session package provided to counselors securely, and that's great. We're just saying that if you are using email, that it's important to secure the package so that it's not easily accessible by somebody that intercepts the email. So there's a question here not related to electronics, but I think it's quite important. It comes from a number of different municipalities, and it deals with volunteers. And the question is, now that the provincial order is in place and so many people are volunteering to get groceries for people who are compromised, things like that, are they automatically included under the municipal insurance and WSIB? And the answer to that is no, they're not. They're not automatically included. If council is, and the municipality is setting up a volunteer system, it is necessary for council to approve the volunteers that are acting on behalf of the municipality. And it would be a very good idea for you to reach out to your insurer just to ensure that the volunteers that you do approve are actually covered by your insurance. But it is not an automatic process. And so you should be super careful about goodwilling people who want to do this, believing that they're insured under the municipality's insurance. And they're not, unless council deals with that specifically. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to pass the floor over to Nuala to talk about the idea of closing borders. And this comes from a number of municipalities where primarily, I think the question's coming from ratepayers saying to council, why aren't you closing the borders of the municipality to keep people out so that we don't import COVID into our municipality? And so I'm going to hand the floor over to Nuala to deal with that issue.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This is another issue that Paul and I looked at pretty extensively, and we also were fortunate enough to have some pretty thorough conversations with the ministry on this notion also, and we're all on the same page about it. So we saw this past weekend a number of First Nations closing their borders, and I scarcely need to remind anybody on this call, but maybe your council needs to be reminded. First Nations are a very different animal than municipalities. They're called First Nations because they are nations unto themselves. They are not a provincial or municipal entity. They are not a creature of statute like we are, like municipalities are. So we should not be looking to First Nations for our precedents and our modeling in terms of going forward with closing borders. First Nations have a different set of rules, even for, they can at any time restrict passage. They run by a different set of rules than municipalities do. So to say our neighboring First Nation, as happened in the Sioux, our neighboring First Nations have closed their borders, that doesn't trigger anything, or ought not to trigger anything in terms of your municipality. Under the emergency legislation, under the provincial emergency legislation, the province may restrict travel. It's unclear to me that that actually delegates down to municipalities in passing a state of, declaring a state of emergency in their community. But for the sake of argument, let's presume that that authority does in fact trickle down. So the first thing I would say is, as we say in all our correspondence, in this time of crisis, now is the time for compassion and creativity with a view to literally world health. Now is not the time to become xenophobic and be unkind and take a hard line on a number of things. So if closing borders is something that's coming from a place of really concern about community health, that is one thing. But you have to be very careful. I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but in the time of crisis, whether it be a terrorist crisis, a medical crisis like we have today, a weather crisis, very often citizens are happy to give up their long fought for civil rights in the interest of abating the crisis. When the crisis passes, it's sometimes very difficult or sometimes impossible to get those rights back again. So be very careful what one gives up during this time. Second, in keeping with the second part of our preach, which you're going to hear all the time, is panic is your enemy. Panic makes everything worse. It makes individuals think unclearly, and it makes communities act with a mob mentality. And our jobs, again, is to quell that panic. It may be that closing borders will froth up some panic in your community, and it might be counterproductive. To determine whether or not closing borders makes sense from a health perspective, you're urged to look to the experts. Look to local public health agencies. Look to the Center for Disease Control. Look to the World Health Organization, and look to the province. And they're not saying to do that right now. What they're saying to do is limit your comings and goings to matters of essence. Only go out for, groceries and medications and that type of thing, and shelter in place. That's what we're being told to do, not to close the borders. So it would be quite a step for a municipality to take. And then as I began this discussion, I was talking about the charter. As Canadians, we are really very fortunate to be living with such a fantastic humanitarian document that governs how we do business and apply the law in Canada. As a Canadian, you have the right to come and go. As a Canadian, you have the right to come and go undisturbed without being questioned as to what you're doing. Those type of things are being challenged now with COVID, where people are being asked to stay home. And we're hearing, I'm not sure how it's going in other communities, but the youth are crawling the walls. They're really having a tough time. They're not in school. The parks are closed. The recreation centers are closed. And we had a problem in the Sioux with youth meeting in closed schoolyards. And the police were going to break them up and say, there's too many of you together, and this isn't a place to convene. In fact, you shouldn't be convening right now. At any rate, my point is, I think we have shaved off that constitutionally entrenched right that you have as Canadians in the interest of COVID. Don't shave any more, unless we're told to, unless the province says you need to be doing this, you need to be issuing these orders, or better yet, let the province issue the order. And the reason I say that is most definitively when this crisis passes, and I'm equally certain this crisis will pass, but when it does pass, there's going to be sort of a rear view mirror exercise where everyone looks at how everyone behaved. And certainly people will be litigious about it. And you don't want to be on the receiving end of a charter argument that my human rights, my civil liberties were impaired by a municipality that overreached beyond what the province was telling us to do, beyond what local public health units were telling us to do. And it really impacted me because I couldn't, do whatever was vital to me. Also want to think about some more practical sides of closing borders. And that is, I think it might be something to ponder if you live in, Peel or South, but in Northern Ontario, we're pretty remote. Many communities don't have a properly facilitated hospital, and travel is necessary. There's also going to be a financial component to it, and that would be, how exactly are you going to police your borders to ensure that no one comes in that isn't resident? I'm not sure how the First Nations are doing it. I think it's going to be extremely costly. But one of the other tenets we often harp back to is, don't pass a bylaw you can't enforce. That is really a toothless tiger. So don't pass something that you can't actually do, because then it's just, you deplete your credibility as a municipality and as an elected body that your council does. So there would be a financial component to it. And it can lead to that really xenophobic, sometimes racist approach if you are not looking at restricting who's coming and going, but rather you're saying, I know who lives here, so who's this stranger? And it sort of casts the light on anyone that is a stranger. And we're getting to the point where we really depend very strongly on strangers to deliver groceries and medical care and equipment and PPE and all the rest of it. So I would recommend very strongly a serious deliberation before you look at closing borders. I'm not sure if it's even permissible. At the moment, I have received questions saying, can we petition the province to give us that power? You can, but I would be very careful what you wish for. Those are kind of my comments on border closing at the moment. But, as we're saying, as the WMG team says all the time, okay, that's what we're going to say tomorrow, unless it changes.
I agree with that, Nuala. And one of the interesting things about being a lawyer and certainly being staff advising counsel is that this is changing faster than we've ever seen before, which makes it an interesting challenge. Certainly, I think if you've heard our thoughts on closing borders, and today our thoughts are that decision is not defensible in a charter challenge. And the reality, to put a finer point on it, I think that Nuala did, there are a number of very well-funded government watchdog professional litigants in Canada. And they look at government action and they challenge government action in court where they think that things like charter rights are breached. The charter right is definitely breached if you restrict mobility. And so then you have to look at whether it's saved under Section 1 with the Oakes test, which looks at, was it a minimal infringement? And it's going to look at things like, what was the province telling you to do and what was public health telling you to do? The point here is that if a small municipality, we've got to keep in mind, and I talk about this a lot in my training, that we run governments. This is a third level of government. So we are absolutely governed and bound by the charter, everything that we do. And as a level of government, as a small level of government that is not as well funded as the province or the feds, we actually present an attractive target to a litigant like Democracy Watch. as an example, and I don't mean to cast any aspersions on them, they do good work, but they're going to be a lot more attracted to take on a small municipality that doesn't have the money to fight them to the Supreme Court of Canada about a breach than they are going to take on the feds or the province about it, which they do on a very regular basis. So that's something else that I really would like councils to think about. You know, do you want to put a target on your municipality here? Because I think municipalities are the ones that are going to get challenged for breaching charter rights before the province and the feds. So that's a comment that I have with respect to that. Nuala, there's a question that has come up, and it comes out of the idea of electronic meetings and Tim's working remotely idea, and that is where councillors or staff are using personal emails. Does that create a problem? And so I'd like you, Nuala really focuses a lot on MFIPA, and I'd like Nuala, you to tell us a bit about the idea of a municipal record and the idea of whether MFIPA is relaxed during the crisis, and whether use of personal emails are going to be municipal records that are subject to MFIPA production requests.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I think MFIPA might relax dates. So in terms of turnaround, IPC might say you don't have to meet this date given the current circumstances and given the lag with receiving hard copies or something of that nature. I haven't heard them say that yet, but it certainly has not in any way impacted what we as municipalities are required to keep confidential and what we are required to disseminate. Those rules have not been altered at all. Using personal email, sometimes sometimes people think, and sometimes it's people that are possibly elected and they're not familiar with MFIPA. They think that if I use my personal email, then I can say whatever I want to say, and it's not retrievable. When you look at the definition of record, and really this could be a session onto itself about MFIPA. So I'm going to try and keep it in a nutshell format for you. But when you look at the definition of record, it's very broad. If you are a city councillor or a city staff person and you are dealing with city-related matters, it really doesn't matter if you're doing it on your iPad or on your city-provided desktop or on your personal laptop. There are certain indicia, they call it, like indicators of what constitutes a municipal record over which the municipality has custody and control. That is really the question. If you're using, particularly, I had a municipality that instructed their municipal elected officials for a period, use your own server, use your own laptops. We don't have that for you. Well, that's a city directive telling you to do it. So it is most definitely a city record. And I guess I would caution, I would prefer if that never happened. I would prefer if it was, if you were never using your personal phone. In fact, I've got a hangover from working at the city where I've got a personal phone and I've got a business phone. Because my personal phone would be discoverable. They could ask for it under MFIPA, and then I'd be in trouble with Children's Aid because I was getting a lot of mean comments from my children. So that can't be disclosed. But to use your personal, in this time of crisis, we are being asked to use our personal phones, our personal laptops, and so forth to advance what would be city business. Those records that are created, in my view, are going to be disclosable. Find a way, encourage your city councillors that are working that way, find a way to distinguish what is city work and what is personal work, keeping it in a separate folder or on a separate drive, something of that nature, because I don't think you're going to be able to hide under the COVID cover once this passes. Those records were created, they were created in the interest of business. You were told to use that personal device during this time of crisis. It'll be considered a city record under city custody.
And Nuala, just really quickly, that I think that part of what Nuala's saying, it underscores again the importance of especially nowadays, of having an acceptable use policy governing what's appropriate and what's inappropriate when using work devices, and also a bring your own device policy, which also covers a situation, the situation that Nuala talked about, where employees and others are required to use their personal devices for work purposes, or where they choose to because for whatever reason, and you're going to allow them to do that. So I just wanted to make that point as well.
Thank you.
Okay, well, we're Mia, you looked like you wanted to say something. No? We're way over time. Oh. So I'm going to wrap it up, but at the office, well, at the virtual office, because I haven't left this one, we've been having some discussions about the needs of our clients. And we are seeing, as you can see on the presentation today, that a lot of municipalities have the same question. And so, the model of WMG has been to try to develop a really good product for you, and then cost share it among the members and various municipalities. That's why, for example, municipalities got the electronic participation bylaw. It cost us more than $8,000 to research and put that together in dealing with municipal affairs and the ombudsman and stuff like that. And we've been able to provide that to municipalities for the $400 and change fee. And of course, if you're not aware, E4M has agreed to subsidize that as part of their not-for-profit efforts in assisting and protecting municipalities. So if you haven't applied for your subsidy with E4M, make sure that you do that, because that's something to help the municipalities. But along those lines, what we were thinking is that if municipalities are aware that they and their neighbors have some questions or need a policy or need something like that, we would be more than happy to work for a group of municipalities. If you get 3 or 4 municipalities together and you need a particular product or something, we're very happy to do a cost share among the 4 municipalities, so that a single municipality can sort of spread the cost as we go through this process among a larger group. I just wanted to make that clear, because it certainly is the model that we're trying to use. And so I would invite anybody to talk to your neighbors about a policy that you think you need, and we're very happy to share that amongst a bunch of municipalities to really reduce the cost. Nuala, I know that you had some ideas on that, and I just wonder if you wanted to comment further.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We're very concerned about, this is just the legal costs that people are incurring. I know there's going to be costs with insurance. People are concerned about keeping people employed, and there's a huge financial burden on all of us right now. So not just policies, but if, say, following this Zoom meeting, something occurs to you like, boy, I am concerned about border closing. I want to know more about that. I can guarantee you 2 or 3 of your neighbors are thinking the same thing. So reach out. If you have a question like that, reach out to 2 or 3 people. It'll save you money, because it'll be the same research we're doing. And it's funny how much repetition there is in municipalities. You're all grappling with the same issues. So take advantage of that. We can't, as lawyers, disclose who all our clients are, but you can speak among yourselves. And I would really urge you to do that, because I would love to save you money. I'd love this to be really cost effective. That was one of the main motivations immediately when this COVID happened. How can we serve our client base? How can we serve our municipal clients where we're not costing them money? Can we give them just a little injection every week, so they know they're on the right track. We know everybody's healthy and doing okay. We give little, snippets of law, but if you need a more thoughtful opinion, you need an opinion to present to your councils, please call your neighbors and see if they're thinking the same thing, and you'll save a bunch of money.
And I guess to build a little bit further on that, if you're thinking of a particular issue and you're aware of other municipalities that are thinking the same issue, we could certainly do or host a joint council session where we provide advice to your members of council, and we can have an interactive discussion with them. We all really enjoy going to council meetings, and I spent a fair bit of my day yesterday in a council meeting remotely. I'm just wondering if anybody knows who I'm talking about there. It works really well, and we're perfectly happy to do that. So I just want to reach out and let you know we want to be as creative as possible, and we're certainly very aware of the cost. And we want to do whatever we can to try to mitigate that. So if anybody has anything like that, we would be most pleased if you would reach out. So just remember that this was available as continuing education for your AMCTO accreditation. So you can reach out to Brittany Hodgkinson to help you with that. And we're going to sign off now and invite you to come back precisely at 10 o'clock on Friday next week. Wish you all an excellent Easter. I hope that you do, in fact, get a bit of a holiday. I know that that's probably a bit of a dream for a lot of us, but I certainly wish you the best. I know the whole team does. We're really happy that you joined us and gave us your time today. And we will see you next week. Thank you so much.
Easter.
Thanks, everyone.